Hey guys, welcome back to Z World News. If you're a fan of history like I am, hopefully you will find this article very interesting. The article I'm going to be reading to you guys today is from theguardian.com, and it attempts to answer the question, is the United States a republic or an empire, right? So let's go ahead and get started with the reading. How the U.S. has hidden its empire. The greater United States as it was in 1941, the United States likes to think of itself as a republic, but it holds territories all over the world. The map you always see doesn't tell the whole story, by Daniel Immerwahr. Okay, so there aren't many historical episodes more firmly lodged in the United States national memory than the attack on Pearl Harbor. It is one of only a few events that many people in the country can put a date to, December 7, 1941. Now, the date which will live in infamy, as Franklin Delano Roosevelt put it. Hundreds of books have been written about it. The Library of Congress holds more than 350, and Hollywood has made movies from the critically acclaimed From Here to Eternity, starring Burt Lancaster, to the critically derided Pearl Harbor, starring Ben Affleck. But what those films don't show is what happened next. 9 hours after Japan attacked the territory of Hawaii, another set of Japanese planes came into view over another U.S. territory, the Philippines. As at Pearl Harbor, they dropped their bombs, hitting several air bases to devastating effect. Now, the attack on Pearl Harbor was just that, an attack. Japan's bombers struck, retreated, and never returned. Not so in the Philippines. There, the initial air raids were followed by more raids, then by an invasion and conquest. 16 million Filipinos, U.S. nationals who saluted the stars and stripes and looked to FDR as their commander-in-chief, fell under a foreign power. Contrary to popular memory, the event familiar known as Pearl Harbor was in fact an all-out lightning strike on U.S. and British holdings throughout the Pacific. On a single day, the Japanese attacked the U.S. territories of Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, Midway Island, and the Wake Islands. They also attacked the British colonies of Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong, and they invaded Thailand. At first, Pearl Harbor was not the way most people referred to the bombings. Japs bomb Manila, Hawaii, was a headline in one New Mexico paper. Japanese planes bomb Honolulu Island of Guam, in another in South Carolina. Sumner Welles, FDR's Undersecretary of State, described the event as an attack upon Hawaii and upon the Philippines. Eleanor Roosevelt used a similar formulation in her radio address on the night of December 7th, when she spoke of Japan bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines. Now, that was how the first draft of FDR's speech went to. It presented the event as a bombing in Hawaii and the Philippines. Yet Roosevelt toyed with that draft all day, added things in pencil, crossing other bits out, and at some point he deleted the prominent references to the Philippines. Why did Roosevelt demote the Philippines? We don't know, but it's not hard to guess. Roosevelt was trying to tell a clear story. Japan had attacked the U.S., but he faced a problem where Japan's targets considered the United States. Now, legally, they were indisputably U.S. territories, but would the public see them that way? What if Roosevelt's audience didn't care that Japan had attacked the Philippines or Guam? Polls taken slightly before the attack show that few in the continental U.S. supported a military defense of those remote territories. Now, Roosevelt no doubt noted that the Philippines and Guam, although technically part of the U.S., seemed foreign to many. Hawaii, by contrast, was more plausibly American, although it was a territory rather than a state. It was closer to North America and significantly wider than the others. Yet, even when it came to Hawaii, Roosevelt felt a need to massage the point. So on the morning of his speech, he made another edit. He changed it so that the Japanese squadrons had bombed not the island of Oahu, but the American island of Oahu. Damage there, Roosevelt continued, had been done to American naval and military forces, and very many lives had been lost. An American island where American lives were lost. That was the point he was trying to make. If the Philippines was being rounded down to foreign, Hawaii was being rounded up to American. A reporter in the Philippines described the scene in Manila as the crowds listened to Roosevelt's speech on the radio. The president spoke of Hawaii and the many lives lost there. Yet he only mentioned the Philippines the reporter noted very much in passing. Roosevelt made the war seem to be something closer to Washington and far from Manila. This was not how it looked from the Philippines, where air raid sirens continued to wail. To Manila's, the war was here, now, happening to us, the reporter wrote, and we have no air raid shelters. Hawaii, the Philippines, Guam, it wasn't easy to know how to think about such places or even what to call them. As at the turn of the 20th century, when many were acquired, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, American Samoa, Hawaii, Wake Islands, their status was clear. They were, as Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson unabashedly called them, colonies. That spirit of forthright imperialism didn't last. Within a decade or two, after passions had cooled, the C word became taboo. The word colony must not be used to express a relationship which exists between our government and its dependent peoples. An official admonition in 1914, better to stick with a gentler term used for them all, territories. Yet a striking feature of the overseas territories was how rarely they were even discussed. The maps of the country that most people had in their heads did include places such as the Philippines. Those mental maps imagined the U.S. to be continuous, a union of states bounded by the Atlantic, the Pacific, Mexico, and Canada. That is how most people envision the U.S. today. Possibly with the addition of Alaska and Hawaii, the political scientist Benedict Anderson called it the logo map, meaning that if the country had a logo, this shape would be it. Now, the problem with the logo map, however, is that it isn't right. Its shape does not match the country's legal borders. Most obviously, the logo map includes Hawaii and Alaska, which became states in 1959 and now appear on virtually all published maps of the country. But it also misses Puerto Rico, which, although not a state, has been part of the country since 1899. When have you ever seen a map of the U.S. that had Puerto Rico on it, or American Samoa, or Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, the Northern Marianas, or any of the other smaller islands that the U.S. has annexed over the years? Now, in 1941, the year Japan attacked, a more accurate picture would have been this: a map of the greater United States as it was in 1941. What this map shows is the country's full territorial extent. The greater United States, as some of at the turn of the 20th century called it. In this view, the place normally referred to as the U.S., the logo map, forms only a part of the country, a large and privileged part to be sure, yet still only a part. Residents of the territories often call it the mainland. On this two-scale map, Alaska isn't shrunken down to fit into a smaller inset, as it is on most maps. It is the right size, i.e. huge. The Philippines too looms large, and the Hawaiian island chain. The whole chain, not just the 8 main islands shown on most maps, if superimposed on the mainland, would stretch almost from Florida to California. This map also shows territory at the other end of the size scale. In the century before 1940, the U.S. claimed nearly 100 uninhabited islands in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Some claims were forgotten in time. Washington could be surprisingly lax about keeping tabs. Now, the 22 islands included here are the ones that appeared in official tallies, the census, or other government reports in the 1940s. I have represented them as clusters of dots in the bottom left and right corners, although they are so small that they would be invisible if they were drawn to scale. Now, the logo map is not only misleading because it excludes large colonies and pinprick islands alike, it also suggests that the U.S. is a politically uniform space, a union voluntarily entered into of states standing on equal footing with one another. But that is not true, and it has never been true. From its founding until the present day, the U.S. has contained a union of American states, as its name suggests, but has also contained another part, not a union, not states, and for most of its history, not wholly in the Americas, its territories. What is more, a lot of people have lived in that other part. According to the census count for the inhabited territories in 1940, the year before Pearl Harbor, nearly 19 million people lived in the colonies, the great bulk of them in the Philippines. That meant slightly more than 1 in 8 of the people in the U.S. lived outside of the states. For perspective, consider that only about 1 in 12 was African American. Now, if you lived in the US on the eve of the Second World War, in other words, you are more likely to be colonized than black. My point here is not to weigh forms of oppression against one another. In fact, the histories of African Americans and colonized people are tightly connected and sometimes overlapping, as for the African Caribbeans in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. The racism that had pervaded the country since slavery also engulfed the territories. Like African Americans, colonial subjects were denied the vote, deprived of the right of full citizens, called racial epithets, subjected to dangerous medical experiments, and used as sacrificial pawns in war.